Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this webinar about natural flood management. I'm Helena Bennett, Head of Climate Policy at Green Alliance, and I am delighted to be joined this afternoon by a panel of experts to dive into this topic further. Climate change is causing devastating effects all across the world, and even in countries like the UK, which are deemed slightly climate safer than other vulnerable countries around the world. We're still seeing really devastating impacts. Last year, we had record heat waves, and as you will all know, we have seen lots of record flooding recently. And flooding impacts in the UK are only going to get worse in the future. Now, the UK government is aiming to attract £1 billion of private investment for nature restoration annually by 2030. And flooding in the UK is currently costing hundreds of millions of pounds a year to individuals, businesses, and the government as well. Natural flood management as an approach has been suggested as a potential market for ecosystem services that could generate private payments for nature restoration. And implementing these kind of measures, such as peat restoration and attenuation ponds on land, could help avoid some of these major costs and provide a significant economic opportunity for the UK. However, there have been some doubts about the effectiveness of natural flood management previously, which have prevented widespread investment and implementation in the UK. But new research from the Natural Environment Research Council, or NERC for short, on natural flood management's research programme carried out jointly by the universities of Reading, Manchester and Lancaster, has quantified the risks, the flood risk benefits of various options, and also modelled economic benefits on a catchment scale. With several projects of natural flood management underway in different parts of the country, can this research be the catalyst needed to scale up implementation? Does it provide sufficient evidence to support natural flood management and unlock private investment? And importantly, how can the government incorporate it into flood risk management strategies, farming and land use policies? So this online event is going to present the outcomes of the NERC Natural Flood Management Research Programme. We're going to have opening remarks from our panel and then go into an audience Q&A. So I really encourage all of you in the audience to please pop your questions into the Q&A function that you can see at the bottom of your Zoom. There is also an option to enable closed captions if you click on the little CC button as well. So joining me today, we have Professor Martin Evans, the Vice Dean and Head of School at the School of Environment, Education and Development of the University of Manchester, David Young, a Senior Fellow at the Broadway Initiative, Jenny Phelps, MBE, a Senior Farm Conservation Advisor at the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, and Green Alliance's very own Jim Elliott, a Senior Policy Advisor who leads on our work on the natural environment. So to kick us off, I'm going to hand over to Professor Martin Evans to present findings of the Natural Flood Management Programme. Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Helena. Just going to share my screen. So I'm hoping you can all see my slides now. If not, somebody shout at me. Hi, everybody. The NERC Natural Flood Management Programme consisted of 3 projects. QNFM, led out of Lancaster, was looking at a range of NFM interventions in Lancashire and the Lake District. Landwise, led by the University of Reading, was looking at agricultural NFM benefits in the Upper Thames. And Protect, led by the University of Manchester, was looking at the NFM benefits associated with peatland restoration in the UK uplands. What the projects had in common was a focus on the quantification of NFM benefits and understanding of the hydrological processes that lay behind the delivery of those processes in ways that would support implementation of NFM within the landscape. What I'm going to do is just briefly outline the approach and some key findings from each of the 3 projects, and then tell you about some of the work that we've done to try and pull together the work across the 3 projects and leave you with some key messages that we think are outcomes from the programme. So Protect was looking at peatland restoration in the uplands of the UK as an NFM measure and ways to optimise it for NFM. The approach was a large series of before-after control intervention experiments where we looked at the runoff from microcatchments before and after they were restored and compared that to control catchments. And we were focused on two key elements of potential NFM benefit. The first was optimizing the static storage that can occur within catchments behind features, particularly gully blocks. And the second of which was optimizing what we've referred to as kinematic storage, which is the delay of water within the catchment so that during a flood peak, we can store water on the hillsides. And that was particularly in peatland restoration associated with revegetation. And on Kinder Scout, revegetation has been quite dramatic, as you can see, I think, in these images, and that was a key part of our study. So some recommendations. Gully blocks can be optimized for NFM by including pipes or slots so that they draw down between storms, and particularly for the sorts of stone dams that are widely used in the uplands. We also need to focus on optimizing the permeability of the dams. Eroded peatlands are full of deep gullies, and the accommodation space that those gullies provide is an opportunity for the installation of larger static storage features. And we've had success with some large bunds storing water in the gullies on eroded peatlands. But hill slope storage overall is more important than that static feature storage. Increasing surface roughness through revegetation delays the flow and allows us to store water on the hill slope during a storm. And for that, revegetation is good, and the establishment of sphagnum moss on the moor is better. And sphagnum restoration is a no-regret strategy, which delivers both carbon and biodiversity benefits as alongside the significant NFM benefits that we've demonstrated. So we think that where headwater communities have significant peatland catchments, peatland restoration should be considered as a potential NFM strategy. QNFM had two key elements. The first was extensive monitoring of the behaviour of a wide range of NFM features, from bunds to woody debris barriers and many more. And alongside that, a very rigorous modelling approach, looking to upscale that understanding to the catchment scales that people live in. And the modelling had a particular focus on making sure that we understood the potential errors associated both with baseline modelling, but also then with our modelling of NFM benefits. So some key findings from QNFM are that we should be intelligently designing features to work effectively in events that flood homes and businesses frequently. So those are the more frequent, perhaps slightly smaller flood, but still damaging flood events. That we should be designing features to stay empty until bank full discharge, features that aren't overwhelmed, and features that hold on to water until after the flood peak. The project has demonstrated a kind of necessity for an intensity of intervention in order to deliver good NFM benefits, so that we need thousands of meters cubed of storage per square kilometre to deliver good NFM benefits. And we probably need to be combining many different forms of NFM intervention to get to these target volumes. And probably we're most able to do that in smaller catchments, less than about 50 kilometres squared. And when we have these features in, they sometimes behave in surprising ways. And so we need to be monitoring them to judge their real world effectiveness. Landwise was focused on a large area of the Upper Thames. Three key elements to the project. Firstly, using local knowledge, particularly farmers' knowledge, to map flooding and to inform NFM measures. Associated with that, there was a very large survey of soil properties, both in the field and using remote sensing across the Upper Thames, to build parameter sets to feed into modelling scenarios. And eventually that local understanding and those parameter sets were fed into models to assess a wide range of NFM scenarios for the Upper Thames. So key findings were that that integration of kind of local and technical knowledge was key. For example, land managers favoured soil-based NFM measures that support continued agricultural use of the land. Land use is a key influence on water balance, but also soil management, particularly, can influence surface runoff in positive ways that deliver NFM benefits. The broadleaf woodland scenarios that Landwise considered delivered relatively small reductions in peak flow for big flood events, but potentially usable reductions. In some catchments, and it is dependent on the geology and the soil types, there is potential for land use change and surface flow interventions to have significant NFM benefits. And a final finding, which actually is in common with PROTECT, is that the delay of flood peaks associated with the implementation of NFM works can be as important as the reduction in flood peaks in terms of protecting communities at risk. So now looking at some of the work we've done trying to pull together messages across the three projects, looking at soil properties, it's very clear that land use and soil management can enhance soil capacity to take up and store water, particularly increasing soil organic matter, and porosity through reducing trafficking is important. And the kind of production and maintenance of pasture and woodland and the incorporation of grass into agricultural rotations also all have the potential to increase infiltration and percolation and deliver NFM benefits. We've also looked across the projects at how much water we can actually remove from flood peaks through our various approaches. The first two lines of the table on the right show the impact of 20% woodland planting in modelling of one Landwise catchment and one QNFM catchment. And you can see that we are storing on the order of kind of low hundreds of cubic meters of water per kilometre squared through that approach. The bottom two rows, the third one is a small catchment where QNFM had a relatively large bund installed. And there we're delivering high hundreds of cubic meters of storage of water per kilometre squared. And the bottom one is sphagnum establishment in a small catchment on Kinderscout, where again, we're delivering high hundreds of cubic meters of water stored per kilometre squared. So you'll see that these are significant and usable volumes of water stored at the flood peak, but they're not the thousands of cubic meters that ideally we'd be looking for. And so a key finding here is that we need to be stacking multiple NFM benefits to get to an appropriate density of NFM capacity within any given catchment. Working with JBA, we've also looked at some economic impacts of some of these NFM scenarios here for QNFM and Landwise. And you can see on the right-hand side of this table, kind of percentage change in the kind of economic costs associated with flooding. And we see benefits that range from kind of single-digit percentages up to about 30-something%. And so the important messages to take from this are that, you know, we have to use the right treatments in the right places, and also, again, the benefits of potentially stacking multiple approaches so that we can sum some of these benefits. So some overall conclusions from the programme. NFM can provide flood risk benefit, quantifiable flood risk benefit, and associated economic benefits at intermediate catchment scales up to about 50 square kilometres. In order to do that, we need NFM features that are designed to be engaged at high flow. We need to be monitoring those features so that we understand the performance and where they work and where they don't. We need to be engaging with farmers and landowners so that we can get adoption of these features at the intensity which is required to deliver catchment protection. Importantly, we think that the NFM benefits are stackable. They may be context specific, so this kind of reinforces the importance of our understanding of the processes that are delivering NFM benefits in particular landscapes. but where we have multiple approaches, we can potentially add up the NFM benefits that we're receiving. And finally, really importantly, across all of our projects, there were significant co-benefits associated with many of the NFM approaches, particularly additional carbon sequestration and enhanced biodiversity. So potentially it's not only the NFM benefits that are stackable, but we may be able to stack some of the funding that's required to deliver the landscape scale change that we need to deliver effective NFM in flood-prone communities. Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Martin. Super interesting stuff. We're going to continue the conversation and hand over to David for some opening remarks.
Thanks, Helena. Firstly, what a fabulous body of scientific research to underpin a really important area of policy. I have approached the question of, is this the next big green investment opportunity from the perspective of our work at the Broadway Initiative, looking at what it takes to create high integrity markets that will bring forward large scale private investment. And indeed, it is necessary and indeed essential for these markets to have robust scientific underpinnings. Without that, there can be no market. But I think it's important to also recognise that robust science alone isn't sufficient. And that's because when we look at it from the perspective of both the suppliers, the landowners, the farmers, they need certainty. They need certainty of what's going to be asked of them, how long they are going to be expected to do that, and what are they going to be paid for doing so. And similarly, on the buyer side, there needs to be, firstly, some buyers identified. Who is going to be providing the revenues that are going to fund the investment? There's some obvious candidates, but some of those are not as easily accessed. Insurance companies, Environment Agency, flood management committees. And that requires some clarity in the policy framework. And at the moment, that clarity isn't there. As an example, was mention of the importance of stacking. Natural flood management on its own is unlikely to be sufficient. We need to recognise that and not make people jump through lots of hoops to try and prove that, in fact, the revenues from natural flood management are insufficient and therefore you should be allowed to do the project. To scale things up, these kind of policy decisions and frameworks need to be set clearly for both suppliers and for buyers. But it's an incredibly solid foundation, and I'm really looking forward to taking those next steps and putting those policy frameworks in place to be able to accelerate this kind of important work.
Thanks very much, David. Jenny, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely brilliant pieces of work. And I think to start off with, if I'd just like to say that I was very involved with the Land Project, which was led by the brilliant late Professor Jo Clark. And just to say a real acknowledgement to her passion around the area of soil and soil organic matter and trying to create the evidence around that. So I'd just like to say that first of all, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think from the point of view of actually delivery, for those of us who are on the ground, we know already, we've been doing a lot of natural flood management projects, and we know that we needed this evidence, and it makes a real case for the fact that we want natural processes to be very much part of the solution. I think what I feel very strongly about also is that we need to engage in the opportunity to have climate resilient advisors out there who can facilitate all these opportunities and recover ecology and have these natural processes. But it's part of a wider ambition to repair our broken infrastructure that we as humans have also put into the landscape. So my concern in some ways is that these are all brilliant interventions, but we need to do more and to have a joined up integrated approach to doing that. And in some of our case studies, we've been able to demonstrate that you can facilitate, as was mentioned, lots of funding that is coming from lots of different partners, and both private, public and third sector organisations, farmers and communities contributing to their resilience. And in one of our case studies, a parish council paid us £3,000, and we've already facilitated over £660,000 worth of co-investment, and that's before we even look at the private markets. So we've been looking at how we can create a template of resilience, of communities working together in smaller water bodies, which fits with some of this research, where farmers can be offered to do multiple interventions, build soil organic matter, which would have multiple benefits for producing healthy quality food, clean water, biodiversity recovery, ecological recovery. And that template is very much there for everyone to consider how we can use these processes, but also repair and invest in our landscapes in a way that will really enable that alignment. So looking at things like the landscape enterprise networks, local investments for private funding, as well as those wider investments that are possible from multiple different sources. So a fantastic piece of work, and a thanks again to Jo and all the amazing work she did. Please don't let's forget soil organic matter in this. I know it has been mentioned, but it really will be a core to delivering our resilience for climate emergency. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Jim, over to you.
Thanks, and yeah, really great to hear the contributions made so far, which overlap quite nicely with the things that I wanted to say. Green Alliance a few years ago did a piece of work in partnership with the National Trust, where we looked at how to start making environmental markets work in practice on the land. And we developed a concept called natural infrastructure schemes, the idea of which was to create markets in avoided costs around the anchor of slow clean water, so the benefits that slow clean water provide, both in terms of flood risk mitigation and providing clean and plentiful water. We did some kind of theoretical work with the National Trust to look at a kind of idealized catchment, to see if this kind of idea would work, if there was actually a kind of a market to discover there. So we looked at an upland, a kind of what we deemed to be a kind of typical upland catchment, and placed kind of bits of infrastructure and a river and different bits of farmland in that catchment, and then looked at what it would cost to implement natural flood management measures that would reduce flood risk for the businesses and infrastructure that were in that catchment, and what the downstream benefits of that would be. And the numbers we came up with looked like, in theory, this kind of idea might work. So we looked at storing 200,000 cubic meters of water in that catchment at a cost of £6.5 million over the length of the project, a couple of decades, with downstream benefits of £11.2 million over that period to those downstream businesses. So it looked like there was a kind of an opportunity here. But in the course of our work on natural infrastructure schemes, and we also later linked up with the landscape enterprise networks approach, quite similar, to look at some kind of practical implementation. But there were a few barriers which I think and hope this new research might help to start to overcome. One of them was that when we were talking to some businesses who might be buyers of kind of natural management benefits, and as David was saying, that's absolutely essential in order to have investment. There needs to be revenue streams for this stuff. For some of them, the way that they invested in flood kind of traditional flood defences for their infrastructure, for example, was based on looking at what the flood risk was based on the Environment Agency's flood risk maps for planning. And then if the risk was a certain level, then they would put in a hard defence, and if it wasn't, they just wouldn't do anything. And so they weren't, in their kind of processes, they weren't able to take account of natural flood management because it didn't fit into those tools that they were using to decide whether to invest in flood mitigation or not. And so bringing some of this new evidence into those kind of tools to enable businesses to see and evidence where actually investing in a natural flood management scheme might reduce, for example, the specification that they need for their hard defences, or might reduce the maintenance costs of those hard defences and therefore save them money, could be really transformative. The second issue, and David touched on this as well, is about kind of making the money stack up. And in some cases, I think it will be the case that the flood risk benefits alone will be enough to make some schemes happen. But in a lot of cases, that won't quite be the case, especially as not all of that kind of benefit can be realized in a market. Not all of the beneficiaries are going to end up contributing. But one of the findings of the NERC research was that the environmental co-benefits of natural flood management around kind of carbon and biodiversity are in many cases much bigger than the economic value of the flood risk benefits, so kind of like the order of 10 times more valuable. So being able to, as David said, stack payments from multiple sources for different outcomes could be really important in enabling these projects to work. But that needs, as David said, needs to be able to happen in a kind of a simple and kind of well-defined way that everyone understands and is kind of happy with how it works. So that's an area I think for policy to look at, and kind of, there's been lots of conversations in policy circles about enabling stacking in recent years. We haven't quite nailed down how that's going to work yet. So just to finish off, these kind of private funded schemes for natural environment are starting to happen. So as part of the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, there's a really exciting project on the wire, which is doing privately funded natural flood management, and the beneficiaries of that are water company, flood reinsurers, Environment Agency, local council, local flood risk committee. So the kind of the people you'd expect. So there is a model emerging for how this might work, and hopefully with this new evidence on NFM implementation, this will be the start of big things. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jim, and thanks to all the panelists again for their opening remarks. Just a reminder to everyone on the call, feel free to keep popping your questions in the Q&A. I've just got a question for the panelists, and then we'll start going to the audience Q&A, so do keep adding stuff in there. I'm interested just to hear from each of you briefly about if there was one ask you could get on the desk of the most important people in the government or in any arm's length bodies like the Environment Agency to ask them to increase the deployment of NFM measures, what would your ask be and who would you put it in front of? Jenny, let's come to you first.
Thank you. I would say absolutely categorically, I would go to the Treasury and try and get them to understand the cost benefit of putting advisors who can facilitate joint up delivery on the ground. Because we know, we've demonstrated for nearly 15 years now, that you need people who can join all this up, who can facilitate and engage with farmers, make it beneficial to farm businesses, to have respect for the expertise of all the partners and the non-government organisations, to help the lead local flood authorities and the environment agencies to actually help to deliver their duties, and actually just have the knowledge and expertise of the people that have those brilliant understanding of the hydrographs and how you manage the landscape. So you need somebody who can join all that up. And so my ask would be that for the Treasury to understand that at the moment, I think every community needs to have access to somebody who can facilitate resilience for them, join up delivery, value local knowledge like Joe always did, value farming knowledge, and bring all that funding knowledge and resource together to enable communities to act now and be resilient to climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. David, how about you?
Thanks, Paul. I'm actually taking time out at the lunch break of the Environmental Economics Conference at the Royal Society to do this webinar. And Tom Burke, who was the keynote speaker at the conference this morning, he said, look, we can't have to do an economic cost-benefit analysis on every single project that we need to accelerate nature's recovery and more sustainable agriculture. And so what I would say is that we should think about how this major body of research now can be presented to government in such a way that it can say that, look, there are uncertainties here, but in this range of conditions, there are benefits to be had. And we are going to actually make a decision that, let's say, 1% of all flood management funding in the country must go to nature-based solutions in line with what the science says is best practice. And I think that's the proactive driver that we need to get this kind of work up in scale, and then it will give the researchers a vast body of practical projects to then monitor and evaluate to inform policy going forward.
Great, thanks. Martin?
I think the one big change that I would like to see is for us to get a broader understanding into the way that schemes are kind of valued, of the different types of storage of water that can contribute to NFM. So storage is a very easy metric to think about. You know, if you've got a bund or a pond, it stores a certain amount of water, and that's easy. But you know, water is also stored, you know, in the canopy of woodlands, and it's also stored during storms, you know, as part of the water that's flowing across hill slopes. And the approaches to kind of valuing NFM benefits don't work so well with considering those types of water storage. So I think we need to think more widely about the many processes that can delay the flow of water past a given community, and make sure that that's built into our kind of decision-making processes.
Thanks, Martin. Jim?
I'd say it's about getting this issue of stacking funding sources sorted out really clearly. Additionality is obviously really important when we're talking about markets and private funding. But there has, I think, been a tendency to apply very strict and often quite crude interpretations of what additionality means that aren't necessarily appropriate to the context of some of these interventions, some of these potential markets. Either way, that's my personal view. However you end up falling on those kind of requirements, it needs to be sorted out quite quickly so that it's clear how, if at all, different sources of funding can be attracted. Jenny's talked about the quite staggering success that they've had in when you've got kind of really engaged local facilitators who are able to bring together multiple sources of funding. But there are questions, I think, about you know, how you might combine countryside stewardship, biodiversity net gain, a carbon credit, a water quality credit, a natural flood management benefit, all of which might come from something as simple as planting some woodland, restoring some peatland, or doing some soil management improvements. And as I say, in many cases, one of those things individually won't be enough money to make that intervention happen, even though it would be a really valuable thing to do. So we do need to get that sorted.
Brilliant, thanks, Jim. We're going to head to the audience Q&A now. So please do keep popping your questions in that chat box, the Q&A box that is. We have a question here for Martin in particular. However, other panelists, if you have comments or thoughts you want to add after Martin's responded, please do chip in as well. So Martin, you mentioned that land managers were less keen on measures that limited agricultural use, such as woodland creation, but the most cost-effective approaches use a combination of different measures depending on the context. And as a result, is there a limit to how effective measures that are more acceptable, I think I'm reading the question wrong. As a result, is there a limit to how effective measures the more acceptable approaches will be? And if so, did you get a sense during your interactions with the land managers of how we might manage these tensions? Sorry, that was quite a long question. Hopefully you got the gist there.
I think this might be a good moment to perhaps bring in John Hammond, who led the Landwise programme, because Landwise was the project that really had the most farmer engagement and where that finding came from. So John, do you want to take that one?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Martin, and good afternoon, everybody. Certainly this was from interactions with farmers in the Upper Thames area of the catchment, and I think whilst we asked farmers to rank their preference in terms of what NFM measures they would be willing to host on their farms, some of the woodland creation options were ranked lower than the other interventions that would allow them to continue their agricultural productivity. I think in that context, a lot of these farmers were in the Cotswolds, where large woodland areas are not a feature of the landscape, so there's a contextual element to that there, and in other parts of the country where that's more of a feature of the landscape, that farmers may be more willing to adopt that. The other thing is around the incentives and what farmers are giving up and how they're compensated for that land that's going out of agricultural production into woodland production. That wasn't clear at the time we asked those questions, and I think there's an opportunity there from a policy perspective. If we can incentivize properly the creation of these features, then I think farmers would be more willing to put them into their landscapes.
Thanks, John. We have quite a few questions in the chat now, so do keep them coming. The next one is, given that NFM measures are likely to be geographically specific and part of an overall strategy with uncertain outcomes, is it realistic that marketable credits could be developed? Should we not be looking for other institutional forms that work in complex and uncertain systems, such as cooperatives, allowing more adaptable multi-party agreements between providers and beneficiaries? That was another long question, but again, I hope you get the gist. David, let's come to you.
Thanks, that's a really great question. I mean, just to be clear, a trading of credits is one form of a market, and there are many of those. Some excellent work's being done by the University of Exeter on multi-buyer, multi-benefit markets, which allow that kind of aggregation and that collaborative sort of investment in landscape scale work. But you make a very good point. Natural flood management is characteristically different to things like biodiversity and even nutrient reduction, insofar as it requires that collective action. Individual action is going to have almost negligible marginal impact. So we definitely need to look at mechanisms, but I would put that as sort of a problem for the buyer side. My suggestion about bringing together the potential buyers to create essentially a pool of funding for these kind of initiatives, and then actually the spatial targeting along with a market mechanism to actually get the projects on the ground would be one way of doing it. But the point is, I think we now have the tools to design markets to solve these problems. Up until now, we haven't had the scientific research to make that possible. So I think we're now bringing those two things together.
Thanks, David. Do any of the other panelists want to come in on that one? Jenny, don't know if you've got any thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the fact that, as I was saying, that it's geospatially relevant where you are, in the sense that the opportunities that you can facilitate to bring together to build these sort of natural flood management projects that have sort of wider benefits is really specific to that locality. And as I say, there is so much funding out there that's coming from multiple different areas before you even look at the private markets that needs aligning, because in reality, the landscape and catchments, the governance of those is complex with lots of different stakeholders, as we know, lead local flood authorities and the district councils and the landowners and the riparian duty, the Environment Agency and all the others. And actually, you know, it's really important, I think, for us to be able to realise that actually achieving a lot of this stuff won't require any more money. Actually, it will be cost beneficial, as I mentioned earlier, just to join it up. And then actually once you've done that join up and you've done that assessment and how you can co-invest in that landscape and how you can enable the ecological recovery. So we're looking at how we can work with farmers to create an environmental baseline using UK habitat classification, aligning all of the baseline by which you can have these new developing markets such as BNG and carbon markets all aligned to UK habitat classification, and then seeing how you can co-invest in that and making the fact that we can then repair the landscape that actually provides not only thriving and healthy environments, but, you know, nutrient dense food, quality water, flood mitigation and local resilience. And that's all possible. So we just think we ought to do more of it very soon. Thank you.
Brilliant. Jim?
Yeah, again, really good question. When we were working on the Natural Infrastructure Schemes project and on working with 3 Keel and others on landscape enterprise networks as part of the DEFRA test and trials, we proposed what we called a natural infrastructure delivery organisation, which would sit in whatever the locality is of interest and be essentially governed by a board that consists of players from both the buyer side and the supply side, so kind of farmers and land managers, for example, as well as whoever it might be, water companies, etc., but also local stakeholders, maybe local council, local nature recovery partnerships, etc., in order to allow exactly what Henry was alluding to in the question of having kind of essentially multiple agreements, potentially over different timescales, potentially looking at slightly different outcomes, but all on the same, focused on the same geographical area. So essentially a piece of governance to manage that. I think that the Wire Natural Flood Management Project is taking an approach a little bit like that. They've created a community interest company. So I think that is a way forward. But a caveat around that is that I think you have to work with the kind of governance infrastructure that already exists in particular localities. So if there's already really good stuff going on, or a really good local facilitator, then I think the approach is to build on that rather than to try and kind of shoehorn in some kind of like externally designed solution that may actually hinder rather than help in a particular place.
Thanks, Jim. Martin, I can see you want to answer that question as well. I'm going to pop another question forward, so if you could bundle the 2 answers up together. What legal forms can you use to underpin stacking and bundling of different ecosystem services, such as NFM, carbon and biodiversity? I know you touched on this in your opening remarks as well, so if you could answer both questions in one, that would be brilliant.
Okay, so the previous question, which is an excellent question about how do you account for the uncertainties and what models do you need to account for the uncertainties? What I wanted to say about that is that although, in my presentation, I kind of made the point a couple of times that the context is important. The science that we've been doing as part of the NERC project, and we inevitably always need more, is to try and understand the processes that underpin that contextual variability. So, for example, in the peatland work that we did, yes, you need pipes within if you build peat dams across gullies to store water, they work better if you put a pipe through them so that they draw down between storms. But different size catchments need different pipes. So, and we've been able to kind of approximate how big a pipe you need, depending on how much water is coming through that particular dam. So I think we are moving towards understanding some of that contextual specificity, so that it's not just, oh my goodness, this is complicated and therefore we need, you know, a different model to deal with it. I think there's some elements that we can handle, but I absolutely take the point that, you know, there are some bits that we still need to think harder about. Legal forms for stacking. Gosh, slightly beyond my expertise, but I mean, where it's happening at the moment in the area that I'm most familiar with, which is the uplands, it's largely around the different kind of statutory bodies pulling together to fund a particular initiative. So, you know, Natural England might be funding peatland restoration for, you know, based on their drivers, but in conversation with the local environment agency, also recognising that, you know, this will deliver for NFM. I guess in a perfect world, we would want to move beyond that kind of ad hoc interaction to a model where, at the very least, landscape change was being negotiated between all the stakeholders and then funded across all of the stakeholders, so that, you know, your landowners and the Environment Agency and Natural England might get together and say, yeah, we can all see that in this catchment it would be beneficial to plant some trees and restore some peatland, and it's going to deliver X, Y, and Z, and we can collectively put funds towards that. I think that would be, you know, a formalisation of the current slightly ad hoc approach. It doesn't move as far as a, you know, a legal structure for doing that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Martin. There's a great question here from someone in the audience. Are there other countries that have relevant evidence and have cracked some of the challenges that can be used as a model for the UK? Who's leading around the globe, and are there initiatives for international collaboration? David, let's come to you first.
I actually think the UK is very much leading in this field. Some of the modelling that's done in other countries operates at a fairly significantly different scale. For example, work I'm familiar with in Australia on the Murray-Darling Basin would just not. It's just when you have areas that flood the size of Europe, it doesn't kind of translate very easily. So I think the key characteristic of this work is that local context that I think we've been talking about. And in fact, I think it's easier to scale up from the work that you've done in the UK to other geographic scales than to come the other way. I did just want to touch on the legal question. I am legally trained, and I do spend a bit of time thinking about those sorts of things. One of the things, if we are to get investment at scale and involving private money, is that you need a level of legal certainty. Bringing these markets together requires us to think about the environmental principles, the economic principles, but also the legal principles. And so even in the practical markets we're dealing with, like nutrients and biodiversity now, the legal agreements that have had to underpin those kind of schemes are not insignificant. But the key really is to have standardization and to involve, for example, people like the NFU in reviewing the agreements and ensuring that they are fair for all parties. One of the dangers with these kind of markets without any kind of governance, such as the way that Jim articulated it, is that you get an imbalance of negotiating power. And I think it's really quite important that is set out in some kind of consistent and agreed legal forms.
Thanks, David. Martin?
Yeah, just I think one interesting model that might be worth considering is the peatland code, which has been developed to support investment in peatland systems for carbon credits and so on, which is effectively just an agreed kind of formalization of the state of the science, you know, that if you do X to this sort of peatland, you will get Y carbon benefits, and recognizing that, you know, that's kind of largely right, but not always right. But everybody has signed up to this code as being the way that we will kind of, you know, regulate or, you know, provide well validated evidence for this market. Seems to be quite effective and might be a model that could be thought about more widely, either in NFM or actually in a kind of broader kind of natural benefits context.
Thanks, Martin. Nick, who's on the call, would like to come in. Nick, can you just introduce yourself to the audience when you talk, please?
Thank you. So I'm Nick Chappell. I'm one of the QNFM team, one of the 3 projects. I just wanted to add that within the scope of the 3 projects, while we most certainly acknowledge the co-benefits of NFM in terms of water quality, ecological restoration, sediment entrapment, and so on, our research entirely focused on hydrological change rather than those wider issues. And there are projects overseas and projects within the UK which have looked at co-benefits alongside hydrological change. One good example is in Iowa, where the university, combined with the Geological Survey, have been looking at for many years hydrological change alongside nitrate retention and designing systems that do both. And there is some developing collaboration between the UK and, for example, that particular project. So I think there is a lot more potential to combine co-benefit research with hydrological change research within the UK, if that helps.
Brilliant, thank you. Great, let's go to another question, and this one's a 2-parter. Do you think there will be separate carbon BNG and NFM markets, or do you see a single nature-based solution market with investors selling a range of credits and offsets? And is there a role for a broker? Jim, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, one that I guess I was kind of touching on earlier, but rather raising the question rather than providing the answer. If I speak from the experience, as I say, of starting to try and set up one of these schemes when we work on the Landscape Enterprise Network scheme in Cumbria, we were trying to combine these things. So the idea was that we would start with a kind of core anchor trade, and that was going to be based around the interventions that provide 2 benefits, one of which was reduced water pollution in a river from runoff from agricultural land, and the other was actually ensuring the long-term resilience of that agricultural land, and therefore providing benefits to food companies who rely on it. So soil management, for example, was delivering both benefits to kind of both those parties. The idea was that would be like a core starting point, and then we would build in other benefits along the way. For example, if interventions started to be introduced that were sequestering carbon, then look for ways to sell those carbon credits. I think, so as I said, the main challenge around that is the additionality requirement, or one of the challenges around that is the additionality requirements that are applied in different schemes. So for example, if you want to sell a carbon credit through the Woodland Carbon Code or the peatland code, there are additionality requirements applied to that. Various tests, including a financial test that kind of says if you have to need the carbon finance in order to create a credit. So that could get quite complicated if you're starting to bring in multiple outcomes. There's also in some, so I haven't been so involved in this recently, so I'm not sure where it's got to, but certainly in the early days of the development of biodiversity net gain, the additionality requirements that were being talked about were very limiting, and I think would make it quite difficult to bring in any other source of funding if you were using a biodiversity net gain credit, for example. So in an ideal world, from an environmental perspective, it makes sense to bring in funding for the different outcomes that your intervention is creating, so that you can fully fund those. Because someone who's interested in natural flood management may not necessarily have any interest in the carbon benefit that's being provided, or the biodiversity benefit that's being required. So they're not prepared to pay very much more for those benefits, even though they might have a big value to society. So it's really important to try and combine them, I think. How you do it, as I say, is still an open question.
Thanks, Jim. Jenny, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that question in particular.
Yes, thank you. I think it's a really topical question, and what's happening where we are in Gloucestershire is that our local enterprise partnership and native partnership have created a climate and nature fund, which is going to look at whether or not you can aggregate all the funding. And I think it's a really interesting space, because if you look at the development of the nature recovery networks, which will move into the local nature recovery strategies, and that we know that, you know, building organic matter and restoring our environment is actually going to have multiple societal benefits, economic benefits now being realised from restoring our environment, that I think that the idea that we're exploring is actually at that local level, you can invest as much as you like in your farmland. And with farmers actually starting to be having sort of really struggling with thought of the reduction of basic payment scheme, and that the revenue payments based around ELMS and others are based on income forgone for national agri-environment schemes. And some of these interventions for natural flood management are particularly around capital payments for farmers, not necessarily revenue payments. The idea that you could create a mechanism by which you could pay farmers as much as you like for actually restoring their land is really, really interesting, because you can do that outside the World Trade Rules at a catchment district and county level. I think the thing that's really exciting for me around that is the fact that the farmers that we work with are really receptive and a part of the team trying to build that resilience and trying to create that mechanism. And I think that we hope that that will be a real case study for people to explore. So yeah, please do get in touch if you're interested to know more about that. Thank you.
Jenny, thank you. We have just about time for one very final question. I'm going to do a quick fire around all the panelists. That is, how will you deal, or how do you propose to deal with uncertainty in outcome and liability if something goes wrong? Jenny, let's come back to you first.
Liability, as in do you mean the intervention failing? Is that what you mean? I think that's
I assume so. Yes. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting one, because obviously a lot of farmers have asked that question for a very long time now. Is actually, yes, I really want to help my community, but what happens if what I've done on my land goes wrong? And I think that was part of that legal question as well. And actually, it has been something that's been quite challenging for people, farmers particularly. I mean, I think it's going to be quite a challenge. You know, if there's small interventions, then I think it's absolutely fine. But I do think that there is an issue with developing markets where there is uncertainty, because obviously if they don't work, if people do invest in natural processes and they still, you know, don't benefit from those physically, if that's a local scheme, for example, then there's going to be real risk and uncertainty for the farmers who are trying to provide that service in a climate that's very difficult to predict how these interventions will react in extreme weather events.
Thanks. David?
Yes, I might try and comment on the last question as well, because I think they're intrinsically linked. So will there be separate markets? Well, there'll be definitely separate buyers for different services. And we can't expect a buyer who really just needs to pay for nutrient reduction to also be paying for the natural flood management and the biodiversity benefits. That's inefficient, and it's going to just add cost. On the other hand, is it reasonable to think that farmers are going to get their head around the biodiversity metric, nutrient neutrality guidance and hydrological modelling? It's all quite difficult to imagine that it's going to be able to work efficiently in that situation. So the work that the University of Exeter has done has been looking at what we would call bundling on the supply side. In other words, making it simple for farmers and landowners to pay for individual nature-based solutions which are bundled for all of the environmental benefits and services. Then through a not-for-profit intermediary, those projects are unbundled and the benefits are sold, and the funding then flows back to the farmers. And that's the settlement mechanism that the University of Exeter is working on. And the key point about that is it overcomes the additionality issue, because you're only contracting with the landowner once, and you don't have to prove whether you paid for the biodiversity first and then the natural flood management and then the nutrient reduction. So I'd strongly encourage you to be thinking along those lines, bundling on the supply side and stacking on the demand side.
Thanks, David. Jim, very, very briefly, because we are running slightly over.
I don't think I have anything to add. I think those are really good answers. I'd just say, yeah, again, look to the governance and how you can use that to share risks between the supply and demand side. Realistically, farmers and land managers are not going to be able to sign up to something that puts them on the hook if £10 million worth of flooding damage happens, because they simply don't have the capital to cover that. So you need to look at how you have agreements between the supply and demand side on how they're going to manage that risk.
Thanks, Jim. Martin?
I think from the scientific perspective, it's just incumbent on us to provide as much information as we can about the uncertainty in what we think the schemes can deliver. And then I guess for that to be picked up through the legal mechanisms and through an appropriate kind of conservative risk-based approach to what we can and can't do.
Brilliant, thank you, nice and concise. Great, we'll wrap up there. Thanks to everyone for joining and the very fruitful conversations happening in the chat and on the Q&A. Really enjoyed those. And massive thanks to our panelists for joining us today, Martin, David, Jenny and Jim. Thanks very much. You can find the Green Alliance report, Going with the Flow, all about this content on our website and Twitter. It's in the chat on the Zoom somewhere as well. Thanks very much and have a lovely afternoon.